ChatGPT said, Clara Morgan never thought an art class would change her life. But the moment she walked into Professor Martin Hale's studio, something inside her shifted. The room smelled of paint and turpentine. Sunlight spilled across wooden floors, and the walls were covered with unfinished dreams portraits half done. Landscapes full of feeling, Martin stood near the front, tall and quiet, his sleeves rolled up, his grey eyes deep with focus. He looked more like a poet than a teacher, and when he spoke, his voice carried the calm of someone who had learned to listen to silence. Clara took the last seat near the window, her sketchbook pressed tightly to her chest. She was new to the city, far from her small hometown, and art was the only language she understood without fear. When Martin handed her a single charcoal pencil and said, "Draw what you feel," her heart stumbled. It wasn't a command. It was an invitation, one that stirred something she didn't yet understand. At first, her lines were unsure. Her hands shook. She wasn't drawing shapes. She was drawing emotions, but she didn't know that yet. Every day she came to class, quietly, sitting in the same place. Her classmates laughed, talked, compared their work. But Clara stayed in her corner, lost in the movement of her pencil. Martin noticed. He didn't say much, but sometimes he'd stop behind her, watching the way she focused so hard her shoulders tensed. He'd adjust her hand lightly, showing her how to let go, how to breathe through the art instead of fighting it. It was in those quiet lessons that something began to grow, a connection too soft to name. Martin saw more than her drawings. He saw the heart behind them, the way she tried to hide her fear of being seen. Clara, in turn, started to look forward to his footsteps behind her, his calm presence guiding without judgment. His encouragement was gentle, yet it felt powerful, like sunlight breaking through clouds after days of rain. Outside class, Clara's world remained small. She worked part-time at a coffee shop, took the subway home, and spent her nights sketching by the dim glow of her lamp. But every drawing was touched by his influence. She began to draw faces, his face sometimes, but she never admitted that, not even to herself. Her innocence wasn't about being naive. It was about not yet knowing how art and emotion could merge until they felt the same. Martin, on the other hand, had once been known for his bold paintings. But after a personal loss, he'd withdrawn into teaching. The classroom had become his refuge, a place where he could guide others while keeping his own pain buried. But Clara's arrival had disturbed that stillness. Her honesty in art reminded him of what it meant to feel again. He saw in her what he'd lost courage to create without fear, to express without rules. Their connection deepened without words. Some days, when the sun dipped low, Clara stayed after class, pretending to finish a sketch. Martin would clean brushes nearby, the silence between them filled with something neither dared to name. She'd steal glances at him, noticing how the light softened the lines on his face, how his eyes seemed to carry a quiet sadness. One evening, as snow began to fall outside, she asked, "Do you ever paint for yourself anymore?" He paused, then smiled faintly. "Not lately," he said. Sometimes teaching feels safer than feeling. Clara didn't know what he meant fully, but those words stayed with her, echoing long after she left the studio. The weeks passed, and Clara's art changed. Her sketches became more alive, her strokes faster, braver. There was emotion in every corner of her pages, joy, confusion, longing, all tangled together. Martin watched her growth with quiet pride, but also a strange fear. He knew what art like that meant. It meant she was beginning to feel deeply, to see the world not just as it was, but as it could be. One afternoon, he gave the class an assignment. Paint something you can't say out loud. Most students laughed or groaned, But Clara took it seriously. She stayed late again, the studio empty except for her, as she painted. Her thoughts blurred into color. Every emotion she tried to hide found its way onto the canvas. When Martin returned to lock up, he stopped at her easel. He said nothing for a long moment, just looked at what she'd created. A portrait not of a person, but of a feeling warm, uncertain, full of light and shadow. "You're painting truth," he said quietly. "That's what art is supposed to do." She turned toward him, her eyes wide, her voice soft. "Then why does it scare me?" "Because truth always does," he replied, his tone low and almost tender. After that night, something in the air between them shifted. It wasn't spoken, it wasn't acted on, but it was felt. The way she looked at him lingered a little longer. The way his voice softened when he spoke to her carried warmth. Still, both knew the line that couldn't be crossed. She was his student. He was her teacher. And yet, emotions never cared for titles or timing. Winter deepened, and Clara's presence became the heartbeat of Martin's class. Her growth as an artist inspired others, but none knew the private current running beneath her work. Martin tried to keep his distance, but he found himself drawn to her honesty. Her courage to feel, in her art, he saw not just skill but emotion. The kind that couldn't be taught, only lived. On the last day before break, he stood beside her as she cleaned her brushes. "Clara," he said, his tone almost hesitant, "you have something rare. Don't let fear quiet it." She looked up, meeting his eyes. "You taught me not to," she said. And in that moment, both knew they had changed each other. When she left the studio that evening, snow was falling again, soft and endless. She turned once to look back through the window, seeing him alone inside, standing near her easel. His hand rested on her unfinished canvas, and for a brief second, she wished she could paint what she felt. The mixture of admiration, gratitude, and something deeper. That night she couldn't sleep. Her thoughts were full of his words, his quiet smile, the way his presence lingered like the scent of paint and pine. She didn't understand why her heart ached when she thought of him. Only that it did. And somewhere in the quiet of her apartment, surrounded by sketches and half-finished dreams, Clara began to realize that maybe art wasn't just about color or form. It was about the people who made us see the world differently. Even if only for a moment, as the year ended, she promised herself to return, to learn, to grow. But deep down, she also knew that her professor's strokes, his guidance, his patience, his belief had already begun to change her. Her innocence wasn't gone. It had simply transformed into something stronger, something more beautiful, something that could finally be called art. Spring came with rain and color, and Clara's art began to bloom with both. Her once soft sketches now carried emotion that reached beyond the page. Every brushstroke had life, longing, and something she didn't yet want to name. Professor Martin Harley watched quietly, knowing he had helped her find this voice. But he also knew that the more her art grew, the more dangerous his feelings became. Clara had changed since that first winter. There was confidence in the way she held her pencil now. Her eyes searched for light in every shadow. Her laughter came easier. Though she still carried that same gentle shyness that had drawn him in, Martin tried to focus on teaching. But the line between mentor and admirer blurred faster than he expected. When he looked at her paintings, he saw himself reflected in them, not as a man, but as the emotion she was learning to understand. One late afternoon, as rain tapped softly against the windows, the class was packing up. Clara stayed behind, working on a portrait that had captured her heart and kept her restless for nights. The studio was quiet, except for the sound of her brush sliding across canvas. When Martin walked closer, She didn't notice him at first. She was lost in the moment, her eyes following every movement of color, her breath uneven. He stopped behind her, watching the way her innocence mixed with passion in her art. "That's powerful," he said softly. Breaking the silence, she startled slightly. Turning toward him, her cheeks flushed. "I didn't hear you," she said with a nervous laugh. "You were somewhere else," he replied, smiling faintly. "That's where the best art comes from." His eyes fell on the painting. It was of a face, but half hidden in shadow, full of emotion and mystery. "Who is it?" he asked. She hesitated, then said, "Someone who makes me feel something I don't understand." He looked at her then. Really looked and felt his heart tighten. He wanted to speak, to explain that what she was feeling wasn't wrong, that emotion and art were twins born from the same ache. But he also knew the weight of his role, the rules that bound him, the quiet walls that kept his feelings locked away. He forced a smile. "Then let the painting explain it for you," he said. Turning slightly, "Sometimes art knows before we do." Days passed, but that moment stayed between them. Unspoken yet alive, Clara began to arrive earlier, to ask more questions. Her eyes searched for his approval in every stroke. Martin tried to pull back, but the pull between them had already taken root. He found reasons to avoid long talks, yet somehow always ended up near her easel, drawn to the way she saw the world. Their connection deepened through the quiet, not through touch or confession, but through understanding. She painted emotions he couldn't express, and he saw in her art all the things he'd buried for years. One evening, he gave her feedback on her latest work, a piece full of golds and greys, chaos and calm. "You're painting with your heart now," he said. "That's rare, but it can break you if you're not careful." Clara looked up. "Then maybe it's worth breaking for," she said without thinking. And he froze. He wanted to tell her no, that art was enough, that she didn't need to tie it to him. But his silence said everything. That night, he stayed late after everyone left, walking around the studio, stopping at her painting. He touched the edge of her canvas gently, as if afraid to disturb the feeling trapped there. He knew he should create distance, but something about her work reminded him of who he used to be, a man who felt deeply, not just painted beautifully. The next day, the air was thick with unspoken tension. Clara avoided his eyes during class, pretending to focus on her work. But every time he moved, she felt it, that quiet pull between them. When the class ended, Martin called her name. "Clara," he said, his voice steady but soft. "You're doing remarkable work, but I think you need space to find your own rhythm." She looked confused. "Are you saying I should stop?" "No," he said quickly. "I'm saying you've learned everything you can here for now." Her eyes dimmed with hurt. "Or maybe you just don't want to see what I'm painting anymore." His silence gave her the answer she feared. She left that day without looking back. The studio felt emptier than ever. Martin sat alone, staring at her chair, at the unfinished pieces she'd left behind. He told himself it was right, that stepping away was the responsible thing. Yet his heart didn't listen. Clara tried to continue painting at home, but every color reminded her of his lessons. Every brushstroke echoed his voice. She felt angry at herself for caring so much, angry at him for walking away without saying what both already knew. One evening, she went back to the studio, hoping to find closure. The door was open, the lights low, and Martin was there, cleaning brushes. He looked up, surprised but not shocked. "I thought you weren't coming back," he said quietly. "I thought you meant it," she replied. "When you said I should leave," he sighed. setting the brush down. Clara, what's between us, it isn't meant to happen. Then why does it feel like it already has? She whispered, her voice trembling. He took a step closer, but stopped, torn by a storm of emotion. Because feelings don't always ask for permission, he said. But they still have consequences. She nodded, tears filling her eyes. Then let art take them, she said, walking past him to her easel. Because I can't carry them anymore. She painted that night as if her heart were breaking open on the canvas. Martin stood silently behind her, watching the truth of everything they couldn't say unfold in color. When she finished, she stepped back, her breath heavy. Her painting showed two figures, one made of light, one of shadow, standing close but never touching. Martin's voice was barely a whisper. It's beautiful. It's goodbye, she said, her voice shaking. He wanted to stop her, to tell her that her art had changed him, that her presence had reminded him of what it meant to feel. But all he said was, keep painting, because anything more would have broken them both. When she left the studio, rain poured hard outside. Washing the streets clean, Martin stood at the window, watching her disappear into the night. His heart felt heavy yet strangely alive. He knew their story had found its end, but through her art, it would never really fade. That night, Clara sat by her window, staring at the city lights, her tears finally quiet. She thought of him not as her professor, not as the man she couldn't have, but as the one who taught her how to see beauty even in heartbreak. She realized that love didn't always need to be returned to be real. Sometimes it just needed to be felt. And as the rain softened into mist, Clara picked up her brush again, ready to turn her pain into something beautiful. Because that's what he had taught her from the start, to draw what she felt, even when it hurt. ChatGPT said. Months passed before Clara dared to step into another gallery. The city had changed with the seasons, but inside her, everything still felt caught between yesterday and what could have been. After leaving Martin's studio, she had thrown herself into her art, painting through the ache, through every sleepless night. Her apartment walls became her canvas, each piece telling a story of longing, forgiveness, and growth. Slowly, her work began to attract attention. A small gallery owner discovered her paintings online and invited her to showcase them. It felt like a dream she wasn't ready for. Yet she said yes, because deep down, she wanted to face everything she had once walked away from. The night of the exhibit came with soft music, low lights, and quiet conversations. People moved from one painting to another, whispering about color and emotion. Clara stood near the corner, heart racing, dressed simply, her hair pulled back. She wasn't used to being seen. She had always let her art speak for her. Tonight, however, every piece on those walls carried her truth, her pain, her healing, and the unspoken love she once shared with her professor. Among the collection hung one painting that drew the most attention. It was titled The Stroke of Silence, the same piece she had started in Martin's class, but never finished. Half of it glowed with color gold, blue, and soft white, while the other half remained blank, rough and untouched. It was as if the painting itself had paused mid-breath, caught between emotion and restraint. People admired it for its mystery, but Clara knew what it meant. It was their story, frozen in time, a conversation that had never found its ending. She moved through the crowd, trying to appear calm, when she saw him. Martin Harley stood quietly near the entrance, older somehow, more tired, but his eyes were the same, steady, thoughtful, kind. For a second she couldn't breathe. He hadn't reached out since she left, and she had convinced herself he never would. Yet there he was, standing beneath the soft gallery lights, his hands in his coat pockets, watching her work with a kind of silent pride. Their eyes met across the room, and the noise around her faded. He didn't approach right away. Instead, he walked from painting to painting, taking his time, stopping longer at some, his gaze lingering as if reading the hidden story beneath each stroke. When he finally stood before the stroke of silence, he stopped completely, staring at the unfinished side. Clara watched him, her heart pounding. She wondered what he saw: regret, beauty, or perhaps both. After a long silence, he turned toward her. Their eyes met again, and this time he smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried both apology and peace. He walked over slowly, and when he spoke, his voice was soft. "You finished it." "Not completely," she said. "Some parts are meant to stay unfinished." He nodded. "Maybe that's what makes it real." They stood there quietly, surrounded by her paintings and the hum of strangers. It felt strange, after all this time, to stand beside him again. There was no anger left, only understanding. "You did it," he said finally. "You found your voice." Clara looked at him, her eyes shining. "You helped me find it." He shook his head gently. "No. You just needed someone to remind you that it was already there." For a moment, everything between them felt still the past. The longing, the distance, all resting in quiet acceptance. He didn't reach for her, and she didn't move closer. They both knew that what they had shared didn't belong to this world anymore. It belonged to the canvas, to the memory, to the art that had grown from it. A guest interrupted them. Complimenting Clara on her work, Martin stepped back politely, giving her space to smile and thank the stranger. But when their eyes met again, it was clear this was goodbye. Not out of pain, but out of gratitude. She wanted to say something, to tell him how much his belief had changed her. But before she could find the words, he spoke first. "You turned your innocence into strength," he said quietly. "That's what art does. It teaches us how to live through the things we can't explain." Clara felt tears build but didn't let them fall. She simply nodded. "And you taught me that feeling isn't weakness." He smiled, his eyes soft. "Then I've done my job." He stayed only a little while longer, enough to see her surrounded by people who now saw the artist she had become. When he finally left, Clara didn't stop him. She watched as he walked toward the door, his coat brushing softly behind him. The evening light spilled in from outside, casting a warm glow around him before he disappeared into the crowd. The gallery suddenly felt quieter. Though the music still played, Clara turned back to her painting. The stroke of silence, and for the first time, she didn't see loss. She saw growth. She saw herself, standing where she was meant to be. Later that night, when the event ended and the lights dimmed, Clara stood alone among her paintings. The city outside hummed with life, rain beginning to fall softly against the windows. She thought of Martin, his steady voice, his patience, the way he had once told her to draw what she felt. Now she understood. It was never about him teaching her how to paint. It was about teaching her how to see, how to feel, how to live without fear. She packed her things slowly, turned off the last light, and stepped into the cool rain. The air smelled of earth and new beginnings. She walked without an umbrella, letting the drops fall freely, washing away what was left of yesterday. Somewhere deep inside, she knew that love didn't always end in heartbreak. Sometimes it ended in transformation. A week later, the gallery called to say her collection had been praised by local critics. Her name was beginning to spread. She smiled at the news but didn't chase it. She painted because it kept her heart steady. Not for fame, not for recognition. Every new piece carried echoes of her past, but no longer the pain. Only gratitude. One evening, She returned to the studio where it all began. It had changed, new faces, new energy, but the smell of paint was the same. She walked to her old seat near the window and smiled, remembering who she was then. So unsure, so afraid. She placed a single charcoal pencil on the table, the same way Martin had once done for her. That day, a young student entered. Nervous and quiet, Clara smiled warmly. "Draw what you feel," she said gently, and the student looked at her, surprised by the kindness in her voice. As she watched the student begin to draw, Clara felt something peaceful settle in her chest. It was the full circle of everything she had lived, every heartbreak, every silence. Every unfinished painting had brought her to this moment. The world outside moved on, but inside that studio the air felt timeless, full of soft light and unspoken stories. Clara closed her eyes for a moment, hearing again the voice that had once changed her life, not as a memory of love lost, but as a lesson carried. And when she opened them, she whispered to herself, "His strokes didn't take my innocence. They taught it how to become art." The rain outside fell steady again, like applause from the heavens, and Clara smiled, knowing the story was complete not in perfection, but in peace. In the end, she hadn't just learned how to paint. She had learned how to live, how to love quietly, and how to let go beautifully.